Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Voters are being systematically manipulated by the spread of fake news. That's the finding of a group of MPs in a leaked report. It warns that the UK is facing a democratic crisis. Well, our technology correspondent Rory Kethlen-Jones is here. The MPs, they don't mince their words. Just remind us of the background to all this.
Well, the Select Committee has roamed far and wide in its fake news inquiry. It's looked at the harvesting of Facebook data by Cambridge Analytica, looked at online advertising during the EU referendum campaign, even looked at potential Russian interference in UK elections. And they've come out of it very worried about a threat to democracy, and they've made a number of recommendations to the government. Here are just a few of them. They want new rules on online campaigning. This is all about advertising on places like Facebook, making it much more transparent who's doing it, so that adverts that pop up and are targeted at particular people can be visible to everyone. You know actually what's happening. They want a social media tax, a levy on the social media networks, which would be used to fund regulation of them, and also to fund a kind of media literacy campaign so that children might have a better understanding of what fake news was. And they want bigger fines for the Electoral Commission. At the moment, if you break the electoral rules, the maximum fine is £20,000. They say that's not enough of a deterrent. A whole programme of action there, but the government has got to look at this and decide whether it really wants to press ahead with it.
Sure. OK, Rory, thank you. Rory Kethlen-Jones there.
MPs are warning fake news on social media is causing a democratic crisis in the UK. A leaked report from the Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee accuses Facebook, Twitter and Google of acting irresponsibly over the collection and use of data. Our political correspondent Carl Dinnan now on the threat from harmful and misleading misinformation.
150 times a day on average is how often we check our phones. That's about once every 6.4 waking minutes, and much of that time is spent on social media. So Parliament's Digital Media and Culture Committee's interim report on fake news makes sobering reading. Chairman Damien Collins writes, "We are facing nothing less than a crisis in our democracy, based on the systematic manipulation of data to support the relentless targeting of citizens without their consent by campaigns of disinformation and messages of hate. And it's all happening in an unregulated landscape."
If people can influence democracy, they have to be regulated. We regulate our newspapers. You can argue that, that regulation needs to be toughened up in itself. We have Ofcom that regulates our broadcasters. We have nothing that regulates social media.
The report raises concerns over the type of micro-targeting mastered by the Leave campaign in the EU referendum, sending large numbers of ads to small numbers of carefully selected voters. The limited circulation means controversial or misleading information is less exposed to challenge. Social media moguls have said they're tackling some issues.
This isn't rocket science, right? I mean, there's a lot of hard work that we need to do to make it harder for nation states like Russia to do election interference, to make it so that trolls and other folks can't spread fake news. But we can get in front of this.
But Parliament's Culture Committee says that's not enough.
Facebook, Google and Twitter argue they're not publishers in the way that newspapers are. They are platforms on which users self-publish. The committee wants a new category between publisher and platform, which can then be regulated.
Until that happens, they believe it's far too easy for the unscrupulous to use technology in order to distort democracy. Carl Dinnan, ITV News.
Revelations about the extent of Russian interference in foreign elections, including hacking and disinformation, are just the tip of the iceberg, according to a report from MPs. The DCMS Select Committee said Britain is facing a crisis in our democracy because fake news and manipulated data are becoming so pervasive. The MPs want huge changes to what social media companies are responsible for, how they are regulated, and new rules for political advertising online. Paul McNamara reports.
Fake news. It's fake, phony. Fake news. This fake news was indeed fake news.
A few years ago, the phrase was hardly known. Now, fake news has its own parliamentary report, and its findings are stark.
You are fake news.
Buckling under the weight of digital disruption, the UK faces a, quote, democratic crisis, according to a leaked copy of the report. It's set to say voters are being targeted with, quote, pernicious views, and their data is being manipulated. Political campaigning in the digital age needs far tougher regulation, according to Parliament's Digital, Culture, Media and Sport Committee. The report makes a number of recommendations. For advertisers, it suggests creating a public register of all political advertising, and that any online political adverts should have a digital imprint so you can find out exactly who's behind them. For social networks, it suggests an independent body that can audit them, and that they should be held responsible for any interference in elections by malicious actors. And for everyone, it says that the fines for any wrongdoing should be far higher than the current maximum of £20,000. The committee will also suggest a tax on tech companies to help fund better regulation. This is all a good start, says former Labour Party advisor turned author Tom Baldwin, but says the report does not go far enough.
There should be a ban on political advertising on social media, similar to the ban that we currently have on broadcast. I propose spot checks on the use of campaigns data. And thirdly, I want to see better verification of users' identity on social media so that you can take out some of the shrillness, some of the hate, some of the trolls and some of the bots that are doing so much to pollute political debate.
Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg apologised for not taking his responsibility seriously enough when he appeared before Congress, a courtesy he didn't extend to the DCMS committee. The report is particularly critical of the world's biggest social network, saying Facebook has hampered our efforts to get information about their company throughout this inquiry. It is as if it thinks the problem will go away if it does not share information about the problem and reacts only when it is pressed. This is a man who also refused to appear before the committee, Dominic Cummings, a man who was the director of Vote Leave in the EU referendum and also the man who leaked this report to his blog site, saying these MPs have littered their report with errors and misunderstandings about the legal framework for elections, thus spreading further confusion. He also said he'd happily answer MPs' questions, just not on the date they set. The Disinformation and Fake News Interim Report will officially be released tomorrow, including one more recommendation: a ban on the phrase fake news.
The government says it's looking into ways of increasing transparency around online political advertising. Ministers also want to crack down on cyber abuse against candidates in elections. The plans follow a report into the extent of fake news on social media and its impact on the democratic process. Here's our political correspondent, Alex Forsyth.
Every day we're subject to a barrage of data. More and more we rely on social media to find out what's happening in the world around us. That's according to MPs, who say there's too much disinformation, particularly around elections, and that could threaten democracy.
This is something you see in the palm of your hand every time you pick up your smartphone and go onto your Facebook app. So it's much more intrusive than before. But secondly, it's not always clear who is advertising to you. The reason the Russians could abuse Facebook to run ads to target people in elections was because you didn't know that's who was doing it.
Online advertising's become a major part of political campaigning. MPs looked at techniques used by Leave campaigners in the Brexit referendum to target certain voters. They concluded there needed to be more transparency about where adverts come from and who exactly is putting them out. This report describes the internet as a wild west where private companies, political campaigns and even foreign countries can manipulate our data for their own ends. It says internet firms must take more responsibility for what's on their platforms, and it calls for reform of electoral law. So how much of what's served up online really cuts through? How discerning are these diners in North Yorkshire about what's fed to them?
I tend to ignore the news, other than what I see on Facebook or on the internet, really, and then I get a bit sucked in by it. There's a headline and you just think, ooh, I'll just have a little scroll down and see what there is.
I'm not very good at having my own opinion, so like everything I read can kind of make me believe that, I guess.
I do find it helpful, but sometimes it can be worrying because you don't know if it's true or not.
Facebook is already highlighting fake news and says it's working on ways to authenticate and label political adverts. Meanwhile, ministers are looking at new rules to ensure the source of election material is identified.
What we're doing is a couple of measures that we hope will really help to get voters to be informed, well informed about digital campaigning, but also to be able to be protected from intimidatory behaviour during elections.
The digital world's undoubtedly thrown up new challenges for democratic systems. This report says urgent action is needed to ensure fake news doesn't crowd out the real thing. Alex Forsyth, BBC News.
Ministers are consulting on new measures to tackle the intimidation of election candidates, in person or online, including a new law which could see anyone convicted barred from holding public office themselves. It follows a report which found social media was the most significant factor driving harassment or abuse. The government is also looking into tougher measures to tackle fake news, as Paul McNamara reports. And be warned, there is some offensive language in this report.
Scroll through the social media profiles of many politicians and it doesn't take you long to find some form of abuse they've received. But soon the trolls behind it could be convicted of a new crime of intimidating election candidates. And those guilty could be barred from public office under government proposals being considered. In the run-up to last year's election, almost half the abusive messages sent to female MPs were sent to just one person, Diane Abbott. Last July, she told Parliament just how deep the depravity ran.
Rape threats, described as a pathetic, useless, fat, black piece of ugly, fat, black and over and over again.
Amnesty International analysed the Twitter accounts of all female MPs for the 6 months before last year's election and discovered more than 25,500 abusive tweets. One recipient was Christine Jardine.
I know the abuse I suffered and the abuse that other elected politicians or people who are not elected, who just put themselves up for election, the abuse that they have to take online, what it does to your family, how it upsets them. You wonder if other people out there are seeing it and believing the things that are said about you. And it's putting people off politics, and we have to clamp down on that. But we also have to remember that this is not just a political problem, this is a problem in society.
Of course, the problem with a lot of these messages is you can't actually tell who's behind them. So one point this consultation will also look at is whether or not online political communications should have a digital imprint on them, making it clear who's responsible for them. And that's a plan backed by Parliament's Digital Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee, who today released their review into fake news, saying the UK faces a, quote, democratic crisis and calling for far tougher regulation of social networks. One of the report's authors is Damien Collins. He says MPs have been asleep at the wheel while the digital juggernaut has been allowed to speed off.
You look to the near future and this problem is probably going to get worse. Using virtual reality, augmented reality techniques, you can already create a fake speech given by someone in the place they never were to an audience they never met and pass it off as real and share that online. Imagine doing that with something really inflammatory during an election campaign. It could take you some time to prove that that film was fake. Now, we're going to need the help of the tech companies to stop that sort of information spreading. Otherwise, that could have a real outcome on elections in the future.
Facebook say they've taken down 2.5 million pieces of hate speech and disabled 500 million fake accounts globally in the first quarter of this year alone. The scale of the problem is vast. What's at stake is even bigger, say MPs, a real threat to our democracy.
Well, earlier I spoke to the Constitution Minister, Chloe Smith, and I started by asking her to explain the two specific things she's proposing today.
So what I'm doing today is launching a consultation document on a couple of measures that will help protect voters in our democracy. One of those is around protecting from intimidation, from criminal behaviour that can have an additional electoral sanction applied as well.
How?
To act as a deterrent against intimidation in our democracy. The how that is done is set out in the consultation document. The other thing that we're doing today is proposing that we enable greater transparency for voters to be able to see where political material comes from online.
And so that means that the kinds of ads that the Select Committee report has highlighted, where it wasn't clear where they were coming from, they will be illegal.
Yes, it could be relevant to the kind of recommendations that the Select Committee report is making. There are other points being made as well in other reports.
It seems quite clear that that the law has fallen way behind the reality of where digital campaigning is now on the internet and the kinds of things that are going on. We need much more drastic reform, don't we?
Well, that may be so. And so what the government is going to do is look at that in the round across various reports that have recently been produced.
But it's clear we're going to need massive law change. I mean, the two things you're mentioning, fine, they need dealing with, but they're scratching the surface, aren't they?
Well, they're two very important things, and the reason they're important is they come right back to how the voter can be best protected.
Yes, no, I know, but what I'm talking about is actually what the Select Committee has highlighted is real fears over the safety of electoral outcomes. You know, don't we need something much, much bigger than what you're announcing?
Possibly, and as I've said to you quite clearly, the government is going to look at all of that in the round. There's a set of things.
I don't know what in the round means. What do you mean?
Well, I think you do. In the round means looking at several reports together.
Your colleague Damien Collins is suggesting that we now need the kind of investigation in Britain that the Americans have got with Robert Mueller. What's your view of that?
Well, perhaps. The government will, by the way, be responding more fully to that Select Committee report. I'm not in a position to give you the full response to it today.
But into Russian interference specifically is what we're talking about.
The government takes that very seriously, and indeed although we haven't seen any evidence of such interference being successful, we are extremely vigilant about it.
You say you haven't seen any evidence of Russian interference being successful. You're saying you have seen evidence of Russian interference in British electoral processes?
No, I'm saying we haven't. The British state has not seen evidence of it being successful.
Evidence at all?
No, I'm saying the British state has not seen evidence of it being successful.
But
what I'm consulting upon is a way to help voters be more informed about what they're seeing. Now, there's a set of things that the government is also doing.
But are you saying, sorry, just to clarify that? I mean, you're saying they haven't been successful. Are you saying that Russia has tried to interfere in British elections or the referendum?
Well, I think journalism has made quite clear that there have been alleged attempts, and I think we also see quite clearly that Russia has attempted such things perhaps in other countries' elections. What is of interest to me and to my colleagues in government is whether we see evidence of that being successful in UK elections, and what we can do A, to make sure that as a state and as a country we are protected, but B, to make sure that voters themselves are well informed. That has to be the bedrock of this.
Do you have confidence in the Electoral Commission? Do you think it's strong enough?
Yes, I do. They are the regulator of elections, and I work with them very closely.
Because a lot of your colleagues are undermining it at the moment and saying, you know, that they have been wrong to pursue Darren Grimes, the young man who's been fined £20,000. What's your message to them?
I can't speak for colleagues, but as I say, as the Minister for the Constitution, I work very closely with the Electoral Commission and I have a good relationship with them.
It's quite confusing for the public, though. I mean, you know, Conservative MPs out there saying the Electoral Commission is wrong. Your message to them is the Electoral Commission is right and has your confidence.
Well, yes, and I stand by what I've said in Parliament only recently, that we have an electoral regulator for a good reason. They do a job. We ask them to do that job in an independent manner.
And you will be looking at giving them greater powers when you look at all of these?
Well, I'm aware that's something that actually they themselves have asked for. There's a number of proposals and suggestions that have been made recently, and the government needs to look at those in the round altogether.
A lot of people are very concerned about whether the referendum result is safe, whether it can be trusted, given everything that's happened. Do you think the referendum result can be trusted?
Yes, I do, and I've said so in the House of Commons, and very happy to say so again.
I mean, do you think British politics has been asleep on the job to some extent? You know, sort of technology has massively overtaken where the law is. Have we been complacent?
No, I don't think complacency is the right word, but I think it is fair to say that actually there are several points that have been raised for how to improve electoral law and take it onwards so that it does fit the times we live in. That's obviously the right kind of area to be looking at, because, as you say, technology moves on, people's lives move on. We want to make sure that electoral law, of course, suits the times we live in and the lives we lead.
Chloe Smith talking to me earlier.